Hello, BookTube. Well, it's Sunday, so first thing in the morning, after I walked and settled the bean, I went out to get the Sunday New York Times, and I thought we'd go through a bit of it together. The Sunday New York Times, of course, is home to the New York Times Book Review, the pull-out section that is still the pinnacle of my profession. That is the thing, the cynosure all eyes turn towards which books are featured there and also towards its bestseller list. But before I got to the book review is tucked away in the middle of the big, thick Sunday paper. Before I got to that, of course, I read the rest of the paper. I saved the book review for last while I'm having the breakfast. And now that we're doing these segments on this channel, I automatically think when I'm reading the rest of the paper, what parts of it other than the book review might be of interest to you. Of course, the book review is going to be of interest to all of us who are bookish people, uh, but what about the rest of the paper? Sometimes there's something in the op-ed section that I have to comment on. Sometimes there's something, in the travel or arts and leisure section that I want to bring to your attention, just because a lot of you maybe don't get the Sunday Times, and because this is a conversation, right? This is an ongoing, incredibly tedious conversation. But when it came to this Sunday's New York Times, finding a subject that is of interest to all of us required me to do nothing more than look at the very front page of the New York Times above the fold. Those of you who aren't familiar with old school newspaper terminology and worldview, you shouldn't be, because old school newspapers are going away. But even so, you have a newspaper and it is a folded broadsheet, and the stories that are above the fold, so that when you hold the thing up just sideways, just in one hand, the stories that you see above the fold are the prime real estate in the whole of the issue. And for today's paper, above the fold, the main story, the eye-catching story, involves us all. To one means or another, it involves us all because it involves YouTube. It's a story by Kevin Roos about a guy named Caleb Kane, who did a video that went viral about how he was sucked down the alt-right rabbit hole by watching a succession of YouTube channels, starting out with some that seem relatively presentable for the parlor, and then going deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole of the alt-right on YouTube. And the story went to press right as another YouTube story was brewing that those of you, I follow a lot of YouTube. I pay a lot of attention to YouTube, just in general, not just BookTube. And a lot of you maybe don't, and you probably shouldn't, because it's awful toxic. It's just awful toxic. The events on BookTube this week notwithstanding, BookTube is an idyllic place compared to the rest of YouTube. And a big event on YouTube this week has involved a Vox opinion commentator named Crowder-Maza, who put together an utterly damning clip of a right-wing YouTube commentator named Steven Crowder. An utterly damning clip of dozens and dozens of instances of Crowder on his own show on YouTube, mocking Maza's ethnicity, mocking his sexuality. In addition to, the clips were taken from rebuttal videos where Crowder-Maza for Vox, for strike-through, would make a political commentary about the cost of medicine or guns in America or racism or whatever, and then Steven Crowder would take that video and do an extensive rebuttal. And during those videos, almost every single one of them, he also conducted ad hominem hate speech against Crowder-Maza, and it wasn't really up for debate. It was the when I first saw that clip montage that Maza had put together and then put out into the world, I thought, well, that's it for Steven Crowder. YouTube will certainly pull his channel, and they didn't do it. It was a huge thing. YouTube got in touch with Crowder-Maza and said, we're looking into this to see whether or not this is a violation of our terms of service. It's quite obviously a violation of their terms of service, but they ended up not seeing it that way. Their first verdict was, this is offensive. Of course, it bothers us as much as it bothers you, but it's within our rules. It's his opinion. It's not targeted at you. These were side comments made during factual political rebuttals. The rebuttals weren't aimed at you. It was just these side comments that and that's not good enough to remove his channel. And then there was uproar, and YouTube decided to demonetize his channel because of this and other things. And It just became very ugly. And I suspect that it's just going to get worse. I suspect the dust up between Carlos-Maza and Steven Crowder caused 1,000,000 hours of commentary to be uploaded from 1,000,000 right-wing YouTubers saying that this is going to bring about the third adpocalypse. The first two adpocalypses being times when YouTube had a spasm of caution in order to woo its advertisers to stay with its site. YouTube is advertise driven, and advertisers who are looking at this thinking that this is an unstable place, this is a place where bigots and racists can spew hatred, and we don't want to be associated with that, we don't want our ads associated with that, those advertisers will just pull, they'll just leave. And YouTube doesn't want that, obviously, so they have to take action of some kind against egregious offenses. And their actions for 2 times in a row were adpocalypses, where suddenly channels who were not offensive at all suddenly found themselves demonetized. And a lot of these creators had gone into this relationship with YouTube in good faith and had come to depend a large part of their income on their AdSense. They weren't doing it for free anymore. So suddenly to wake up the next morning and realize, okay, well, what was a going income from me yesterday is now nothing. When you've hired people and invested in equipment and sound stages and whatnot, that was a shock. And that happened twice, and now the strong suspicion is that a much more severe adpocalypse is coming because of this conflict. Carlos-Maza seems to be inviting that. He has not been satisfied with the demonetization of Steven Crowder's videos. He wants Crowder gone from the platform. Deplatforming is just have him gone, send him out into the wilderness, put him where no one can hear him. It's fascinating for me, soiling, but fascinating. I can't look away because this is the dawn of a new technology. This is the dawn of a new thing in society. To me, it's even more interesting than the dawn of television, because it's so much more immediate. Because these people are, building what their followers view as personal relationships. I just think it's all utterly fascinating. And this Caleb Kane kid, his video is fuel for that fire. His video suddenly becomes 10 times more relevant than it was when it was first uploaded, because this is the main question. This is the main contention of people like Carlos-Maza. They're saying Steven Crowder is calling himself a comedian, and he's using that to broad brush away all these horrible things that he does. And if YouTube lets him get away with it, then this is how young men come to this site and get radicalized. This is a call to harass me, a call to dox me, a call to make my life miserable. Maza showed evidence that has happened. And Crowder doesn't do himself any favors in the whole controversy with his denials. There's an incredibly offensive T-shirt that is the hallmark of his show. He sells it in his shop. It's on the greeting page of his merchandise, and he tells us a schmarmy high school bully lie about it, that it's not really what it obviously is. Instead, it's something real close to that, but not the same. It's these people don't read history, of course, but if they did read history, they would realize that they are explicitly mimicking the fascist playbook. This is exactly how this happens. It's not that fascists ever get to a seat at the table by starting out on the first day in the first minute saying, we want you to stomp people's heads on the curb. They don't ever do that. They don't ever do that. They work by a very, very set program. It has worked in a dozen countries in 5 or 6 different historical epochs. And Steven Crowder, of course, does not know those epics from a cow in a yard, but he is following them to a T, to a T. To fly under the radar and say, I'm just goofy, I'm just a comedian, you're reading the T-shirt wrong, and all this sort of stuff, when he knows exactly what he wants to do. And he knows what he wants his followers to do. But anyway, the reason that this is on my mind is because it's the very first thing. It's the front of the New York Times above the fold, the making of a YouTube radical. And I don't know if you can tell, you probably don't. If you're wise, you only watch BookTube and maybe some farming channels or some kids video channels and stuff like that. If you're wise, you stay out of the cesspools of YouTube. But If you do, and even if you don't, I want to point out to you that 9/10 of that graphic is the cesspool of YouTube. There's Sargon of Akkad, jokes about raping people. There's Paul Joseph Watson, part of InfoWars. There's Alex Jones, who is InfoWars. There's Milo Yiannopoulos, who says there's no such thing as homophobia. There's Stefan Molyneux, who says with just a straight face to Dave Rubin. I'm sure that Dave Rubin is on here somewhere. Dave Rubin does not say anything objectionable. He just gives a perfectly well-lit platform for other people to do it. It's in many ways worse than all of them put together, because he is presentable. You would have him in the parlor. Stefan Molyneux is on here 3 times. 1, 2, 3. And there's a good reason for that, because he's a white nationalist and a racist and a white supremacist, and unapologetically so. Says that black people have smaller brains than white people and are just biologically less intelligent, less capable, less adaptable, less improvable is a word he doesn't use, but his predecessors 60 years ago used it. And if you confront him on the subject, he will say, I'm not a white supremacist, because I say that all races have different capabilities, and Orientals have even more capabilities than white people. And this actually works. In certain circles, dodges like that actually work. And you want to stop the guy. You shouldn't ever try, but you want to stop the guy and say, who do you think you're fooling? You're saying that you're not a white supremacist because you're saying Asians are superior to you, but you are also saying that whites are superior to blacks, biologically. That makes you a white supremacist. And he has these people have lots of other really, really wretched ideas. But the really important thing about this graphic, the thing that I'm amazed got by the editors of the New York Times, is that this is not all of a piece. It's not all of a piece. You have ContraPoints, who rails against these people. She rails against people like Stefan Molyneux. You have the Call of Dusty, who rails against these people, and most bewilderingly of all, you have Philip DeFranco, who's makes his thoughts, his opinions about the alt-right extremely well known, and presents a balanced news show that millions of people watch. He's not even remotely connected to people like Stefan Molyneux or Stephen Crowder. That is, you can't really make him out, but that is the lout Stephen Crowder, who says that there is no systematic racism in America, says there's no such thing as sexual bias in America, that sexism, decisions made on it, laws passed about it, are absolutely a figment of the left's imagination, says that catastrophic climate change is A, not happening, and B, in no way connected to human activity, says that America does not have a gun problem, when every day on his channel he also has to talk about the latest gun massacre. The thing that mystifies me about this is that this graphic seems to lump all these people together, when there are at least 3 people on this graphic who absolutely should not be there. And the caption for the graphic is so weaselly. Commentators from across the political spectrum have filled YouTube with a complex stew of emotional content. No. You don't get to say that in an article about a guy going down the alt-right rabbit hole on YouTube. You don't get to say that. That is not what this image is meant to say. This is you covering your behind. This image is meant to be the toxic rabbit hole that this kid fell down in the wilds of West Virginia. That's what this is meant to symbolize. There's no way to avoid that if you put this on top of a story about that. So if I were these people, Call of Dusty, ContraPoints, especially Philip DeFranco, I'd be infuriated at being on this. And the story goes on at enormous length. What was his name, man? Kevin Roose makes a fundamental New York Times deep background reporter mistake of assuming that we care about Caleb Cain as a person. And we don't. We don't at all. We care about him as a cautionary tale, as a stand-in for a whole demographic of feckless, too online young white men. And unfortunately, the profile, once you go past the jump to the inside, the main body of the story, it goes on for probably 4,000 words about this kid, and I found it hard to hang on. It wasn't quite the story about the radicalization of the alt-right that I would wish it had been, but it's all over the internet, So, of course, that was the part of the Sunday New York Times that involves YouTube, that isn't the book review. But then we go to the book review, and last week the book review was extra big and wonderful. It was a summer books thing, and we pay the cost this time around because this time the book review is a little smaller. And still had some interesting things. The front article, the thing talk about prime real estate. The front of the New York Times book review is the big thing. That is the big book. It's a big deal for any author to get in the Sunday New York Times book review, but to be on the cover, and this time it's Elizabeth Gilbert's City of Girls, which is reviewed by David Cates. That's a bit of a surprise to me. I'm kind of surprised that in 2019 the Times assigned that review to a man, but he seems to like the book. And then I couldn't help but notice this, and you're going to see why. This is very expensive real estate, and this is an amazing thing. This is a full-page color ad or duotone ad about James Ellroy, with a quote by Joyce Carol Oates calling him America's Dostoevsky. And it shows us not only this storm, which is his new book, but these 3 reprint volumes of his covering all of his work that is coming out. I'm hoping that we'll see those on this channel soon. Next week would be nice. But that's a big deal. You open the New York Times book review and you see a full-page ad for an author, you kind of expect that this storm is going to be reviewed in this issue, and positively. But then it turns out that's not the only James Ellroy attention in here. He's also the subject of the By the Book feature, where the Times asks writers a particular preset set of questions, and they answer them, what's on your nightstand, what books are overrated, that sort of thing. And I thought his answers were fascinating, but the one thing that really fascinated me about this is that I don't know anything about this author. I don't know anything about most authors. I don't follow them. I don't read their long interviews in the Paris Review or anything like that. And until I read Ellroy's answers to these questions, I did not know that he was a certifiable loon. And he is. He's a certifiable loon. He has no blue M&Ms in his bag. And the reason I know that is because he's a crackpot. When the first question is, what books are on your nightstand? And his answer is the Bible, Prayer by Pastor Timothy Keller, and of late, one of the groovy Israeli hitman novels of Daniel Silva, Silva's a Gas. Okay, so in 2 sentences, he's using idiom that is 60 years out of date. He's using the hepcat idiom of his heyday in the 60s. In one little paragraph, 2 different things. No one calls things groovy anymore, and no one says that things are a gas anymore. And at first I thought, okay, well, it might just be affect. But no, he goes on to do that all throughout. He calls his apartment a pad. He calls people cats. And a reader in 2019 who is not 70 years old is going to look at that and say, what on earth is this guy talking about? And the reason for that is because Ellroy has obviously made a crackpot's decision to just keep talking like it was 1963. He's just going to keep talking that way. And yet, if you were to confront him with someone in 2019 who had just decided to keep using mid-18th century English slang in their conversations, just keep doing that. Just keep calling people by words that made sense then, but it's been that long, and that since they've been used. If Ellroy were confronted with such a person, he would have a whole bunch of critical things to say about them. But it's no trouble at all for him to do it himself. So he's nuts. I guess I should have inferred that from his books, which are gloriously insane. It's just seeing it in person is a little bit much. And there was also a nifty, snarky letter from David Smaller of San Diego. He writes, the opening paragraph of Joseph Ellis's review of Rick Atkinson's The British Are Coming is more than a wee bit patronizing. And then he quotes it. My old mentor, Edmund Morgan, used to say that everything after 1800 is current events. According to Morgan's law, Rick Atkinson has been doing first-rate journalism, enjoying critical and commercial success for 3 masterly books on World War II. Close quote. And then David Smaller goes on. I'll break the news to him. Millions of Americans consider Atkinson, David McCullough, and Barbara Tuchman, to name just a few, as scholarly historians and a delight to read, even if failing on an artificial litmus test by someone ensconced in the ivory tower of academia. And I agree. Anything after 1800 is current events? What a nonsensical thing to say. And I also don't completely trust that Edmund Morgan said that. But anyway, then we move on, and the main disappointment that I had this time around, and it's no offense to the author, my main disappointment with the book review this time around is that their crime writer, Marilyn Stasio, who I've praised in these Sunday Times walkthroughs, she does a roundup regularly of crime novels, 2-3 crime novels, where she mostly summarizes the plots, and it's a kind of a column. It's just meant to note the latest crime and thriller and mystery novels that are coming out. And the first book in her trilogy, or no, there are 4 books that she does here. And the first of them is This Storm by James Ellroy, the very guy who is the by the book section and who's been called by Joe's Carol Oates America's Dostoevsky. Well, This Storm is an amazing book. It deserved to be on the front page, but if Elizabeth Gilbert's book City of Girls is also amazing. So if you're not going to put it there, it deserves a full page review on its own. It's not a genre novel just because it writes about crime. That bugged me. That really did. That bugged me. I consider that to be a genuinely strange editorial decision on the part of the people running the book review. They had to have thought about it. They had to have said, well, what are we going to do with This Storm? With Ellroy's new book? And somewhere along the line, there had to be a decision. Well, we're not going to give it a full page like we do to Spring by Ali Smith. We're not going to treat it as a non-genre thing. Instead, we're going to lump it into a 4-book roundup on the Crime Watch. And I don't know whether or not there would have been dissenting opinions about that, or whether or not there was even a discussion. Had I been there for that, I would have said, no, you can't do that at all, any more than you could do James M. Cain if he had a new book. You wouldn't do that in a crime roundup. This Storm is a very serious modern American novel. Just because it happens to be about crime, it's to put it in a crime roundup with the 10th book in an Italian cozy murder mystery series is... Maybe I'm getting too worked up. Check my pulse. To put it in a roundup like that, no offense to the writer of the roundup or to the authors of those other books, but it's tremendously more accomplished and ambitious than those other books, and to put it in that roundup is a bit of an insult. It's a bit of a slight. If I were Ellroy and I were a hep cat, I would probably wonder why that had happened. What was that decision? But anyway, we get a full-page review of David McCullough's book, The Pioneers, that does take it to task a little for airbrushing Indian massacres. I'm surprised that it didn't lead with that, and I'm surprised it doesn't do more of that. So a reviewer named Barry Weiss does a review of White by Bret Easton Ellis, his new book-length screed about snowflake millennials, and takes it to task. It's a negative review, which is not the only negative review in here either. There's also Caleb Crane does a review of a novel from Soft Skull Press called Loudermilk, and largely dislikes it, largely calls it a failure. And it was kind of strange. That's a kind of a strange phenomenon, because a paperback from Soft Skull Press would ordinarily not be under consideration for the Times Book Review anyway. Think of the hundreds and hundreds of full-dress new hardcovers from much larger presses that were hoping for a review in the Sunday Times this week, or jockeying for a review, and it goes to a paperback release from a small press, and it's negative. I have to assume, in a case like that the reason the review exists at all is because the reviewer wanted to say something negative about the book. I don't know, one way or another. There's a full page review on the new biography of Walter Gropius, which I thought was atrocious. No, I didn't think the biography was atrocious. Just he's atrocious, and he keeps getting biographies. And Carl Zimmer, the author of She Has Her Mother's Laugh, a fantastic book, reviews The Pandemic Century and gives it, generally speaking, a thumbs up, which I was very happy about. I like that a lot. And also Zachary Karabell, who is an author and investor, does a half-page review of Oliver Bullo's Moneyland, which was, those of you who are maybe new and don't know what I'm talking about, I am the editor of an online literary journal called Open Letters Review, and we ran a review by a booktuber, by David Murphy, of Moneyland, and it was quite good. In better, in some ways, I would say, I'm a little biased, than this review in the New York Times. That's always bracing when that happens. And then we're done. Believe it or not, that's it. They have a full-page ad for children's books, none of which I've read. And then we move on to the back to all the talk about bestsellers and whatnot, which is, the first go-to spot for a lot of people wanting to know who's where and what and for how long. And that's always interesting to me too. But I much more prefer the reviews. I'm a little confused. That's all. I'm a little confused. To my mind, the books that warrant a full page standalone review in the New York Times Book Review on Sunday are fairly evident for any given week. They're fair to me. To my mind, they're fairly evident. Of course, City of Girls. Of course, the new David McCullough. But of course, the new James Ellroy. And so that decision confuses me. But that was the New York Times for this week. We started off with a controversy on YouTube, which is just beginning. This controversy is just beginning. Crowder-Maza is trying to marshal big name creators and influencers to put the spotlight, to put the pressure on YouTube to do more than simply demonetize Steven Crowder. They want him gone. Maza wants him gone. And Crowder is doubling down himself. He has mentioned on his own channel that his videos were largely demonetized anyway. This is just the final straw, and that he gets most of his money directly from his support group. So Maza points out demonetizing him is a fig leaf. It doesn't do anything. He's just saying himself that it's not really a chastisement. The thing to do is to boot him from the channel, like was done to InfoWars, for instance. And I'm curious to see where that goes. I'm curious to know, actually, now that I've got you all here, I'm curious to know what you think of it. Just in a general sense, I don't want to invite you at all to familiarize yourself with the sinkhole of YouTube. If you don't know about the cesspool of YouTube, then you shouldn't, because it's a large waste of time. I have the time to waste, but it's also soiling, and you don't have the time, and you don't want that anyway. But in general terms, now that I have you here, what do you think? I mean, these things are ruled by money, so talking about it on philosophical or ethical grounds is a little bit beside the point, but let's do it anyway. On a platform like YouTube, would you rather that a creature like Steven Crowder, who is basically soft, rabble-rousing, he's not ever coming out and saying, you guys should all dox this guy, you guys should punch him if you see him on the street. He's not coming out and saying that, but he is a Bund leader, definitely. He is a stormtrooper leader, definitely. He knows what he wants America to be like, regardless of on his channel of whether or not he very disingenuously says, I don't want anybody to hurt anybody. There is a legitimate process of radicalization that happens with people like him or other channels like him, like Paul Joseph Watson, or there is a legitimate danger of radicalization where an aimless, feckless young man would find these videos that give him ready-made enemies. Laura Southern says the Muslim immigrants are a ready-made enemy. They are the enemy. They want to destroy you. So what do you think when it comes to something like that? Do you think those people should have a place on YouTube anyway? Or do you lean more towards saying just no censorship? Censorship itself is a much more besetting evil than any of the things these people say. You counter bad ideas with good ideas, not with removing bad ideas. Do you fall closer to that camp? Or do you say, well, no, if these people are here spewing stuff that's demonstrably evil, demonstrably wrong, when Steven Crowder says that there's no climate crisis, he's demonstrably wrong. And he knows that he is. He's feeding that misinformation to a bunch of people who want that information to be true. And they don't care whether it's right or not. Do you say, if a channel is doing that, I mean, one of the people that's in this montage, I think, is Gavin McInnes, who founded a hate mob. He founded a hate mob called the Proud Boys. Went to an event in New York City calling for violence at an event. There was no filming specifically because he knew what he was going to be saying. Comes outside, there are riots in the streets, and he holds up a sword while he's leaving the scene. Someone like that, do you look at someone like that, or someone like these people, like Stefan Molyneux, saying, I wish that it weren't true, but unfortunately black people have smaller brains than white people. I wish that it weren't true. I'm not a racist. Do you think maybe, do you fall more on the side of saying these people shouldn't be here? That there's no point in saying you counter bad ideas with good ideas. They have millions of followers. They should be gone. They're doing harm with every video. Do you fall more along that line? Or what about the third stance, which would be that people like this young kid really need to just take more control of themselves, and that none of us should be bothering in whether or not these young men radicalize themselves. I mean, there's a kind of an old school admonition appeal to that kind of argument, but I don't think we're neutral anymore. I don't think any of us are uninvolved. I don't think any of us can say, well, these guys just ought to pull up their pants and make their own ideas. Because while we're saying that, in the meantime, these are the guys who are buying bumper stocks and shooting up schools, shooting up subway stations, shooting up restaurants. We are in danger from these radicalized, feckless white kids. So I don't think you can just say, well, they ought to behave better. Where do you stand on the subject? Would you rather that YouTube just started booting people? And if you are wondering whether or not that's the right thing, what about the situation that I described between Crowder-Maza and Steven Crowder? I'm not asking you to go down the rabbit hole of those videos, but the situation that I described. Crowder-Maza puts out political videos on subjects like gun control. Steven Crowder rebuts those videos with 30 or 40-minute videos of his own to an audience of millions. And in between rebuttals, refers to Maza by all sorts of homophobic and racist slurs. If, in a situation like that, is that just freedom of speech? Is that within his rights to do? That we don't all have to be nice to each other? And that Crowder-Maza should just grow a thicker skin? Or should that mean that somebody gets booted? I find the whole subject fascinating. That's why I've been watching so many videos. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. I've gone way too long. And it hasn't been about book reviews. It's been about YouTube drama. Oh, God help us. I'll go back to talking about books. Thank you, BookTube.